He was born to become king, but he had to wait almost his entire life for the crown. Edward was the eldest son of Queen Victoria. From the moment he was born, everyone knew that one day he would become King of Britain. But being the heir to the throne was not an easy life. His mother, Queen Victoria, was one of the most powerful monarchs in British history. She expected Edward to behave perfectly. She watched his education closely. She worried about his decisions. And she often believed that her son was not serious enough to become king. Edward grew up under enormous pressure. He was surrounded by rules, tradition, and expectations. But Edward wanted something different. He wanted to experience life. He enjoyed social gatherings. He loved meeting people. And he had a personality very different from his strict mother. Then Edward met Alexandra of Denmark. Alexandra was young, beautiful, elegant, and known for her warm personality. Edward was immediately attracted to her. Their relationship developed quickly, and in 1863, Edward and Alexandra were married. Their wedding became a major royal celebration. But Alexandra was not simply going to become the wife of a future king. She would become Edward's greatest emotional support. The young couple began their married life together. They had children. They traveled. They attended royal events. And they became one of the most recognizable couples in Europe. But behind the beautiful royal image, Edward still lived under his mother's enormous shadow. Queen Victoria remained on the throne. Year after year, decade after decade, Edward waited. He watched his mother rule Britain. And he knew that his own reign was still far away. Alexandra stayed beside him. She understood his frustration. She understood how difficult it was to live as the heir while someone else controlled the crown. Edward was becoming older. His children were growing up. And still, he was only the Prince of Wales. He had been born to become king. But he had no idea when that day would finally come. Then tragedy changed everything. Queen Victoria's health began to decline. The woman who had ruled Britain for more than 60 years was approaching the end of her reign. Edward knew that his childhood dream and lifelong responsibility were finally getting closer. But he also knew something else. Becoming king would mean losing his mother. The crown he had waited for all his life was about to arrive. And with it, a completely new chapter would begin. Queen Victoria's health was getting worse. For Edward, the moment he had waited for his entire life was finally approaching. But this was not a moment of celebration. It was the beginning of a painful goodbye. Edward had spent decades living in his mother's shadow. She had controlled much of his life. She had criticized his choices. And she had often worried that he would never become the king she wanted him to be. But despite their complicated relationship, Edward was still her son. And he loved her. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died. She had ruled Britain for more than 63 years. Edward was now King Edward VII. He was nearly 60 years old. For most men, that would have been late in life to begin a completely new chapter. But for Edward, his real life as king was finally beginning. The new king was very different from his mother. Victoria had represented discipline, tradition, and strict Victorian values. Edward brought a different energy to the monarchy. He loved conversation. He enjoyed meeting people. He was fascinated by politics. And he understood the importance of personal relationships. Queen Alexandra stood beside him. She was elegant, popular, and deeply devoted to her husband. But Alexandra also had her own struggles. She had suffered from serious health problems, and her hearing gradually became worse. Yet she continued supporting Edward. Together they began traveling throughout Britain. They visited hospitals, military facilities, public events, and important cities. Edward wanted people to see the monarchy differently. He wanted the king to be closer to ordinary society. He believed that personal relationships could strengthen Britain's position in Europe. His social life also became famous. Edward enjoyed entertaining. He surrounded himself with politicians, diplomats, artists, writers, and members of European royal families. His dinner parties became legendary, but his popularity did not mean that his reign was free from controversy. Edward had spent many years living a very social life. He had friendships that created gossip, and his private relationships sometimes became the subject of public attention. Alexandra knew her husband's personality. Their marriage was not perfect, but there was a strong bond between them. She remained the person who stood closest to him. Meanwhile, Edward faced a changing Britain. The old Victorian world was disappearing. New technologies were changing society. Cities were growing. Politics were becoming more democratic. And Britain was entering a new century. Edward understood that the monarchy had to change with the times. He wanted to modernize the royal image without destroying tradition. His reign would become known for elegance, diplomacy, and a new social style. But Europe was becoming increasingly complicated. Powerful nations were competing with each other. Political alliances were forming, and tensions were growing. Edward began using his personal relationships with other European rulers to improve Britain's position. He traveled. He negotiated. He built friendships. And he became an important diplomatic figure. For a man who had waited almost 60 years to become king, Edward suddenly found himself at the center of European politics. But his time on the throne would be much shorter than anyone expected. He had waited his entire life for the crown. And now, he had only a few years to leave his mark on history. Edward had finally become king. But the world around him was changing quickly. Britain was entering a new century. New technology was transforming everyday life. Cities were growing. Politics were changing. And Europe was becoming increasingly tense. Edward understood that Britain could not remain isolated. He believed personal relationships between rulers could help prevent future conflicts. So he traveled across Europe. He visited foreign capitals. He met emperors, kings, presidents, and political leaders. His personality became one of his greatest diplomatic strengths. Edward was comfortable in conversation. He could make people laugh. He could put nervous guests at ease. And he knew how to build relationships. Queen Alexandra often accompanied him. She was admired for her elegance and kindness. People were fascinated by the royal couple. Wherever they traveled, crowds gathered to see them. But behind the public image, Alexandra was dealing with serious health problems. Her hearing had deteriorated, and she often struggled to follow conversations. Yet she continued appearing beside Edward. She rarely allowed her difficulties to stop her royal duties. Edward also faced criticism. Some people believed that he spent too much time enjoying luxury. Others believed that his social life was too extravagant. But Edward saw his social connections as part of his role. He believed that meeting influential people could strengthen Britain's position. And slowly, his approach began to produce results. Britain improved its relationships with France. The relationship became known as the Entente Cordiale. It was an important diplomatic development. For Edward, this was one of the achievements he was proudest of. He had spent years being treated as an inexperienced prince. Now he was proving that he could influence international politics. But Edward's reign was not only about diplomacy. He also cared about modernizing the monarchy. He supported changes in royal ceremonies. He encouraged a more approachable royal image. And he helped make the monarchy feel more connected to modern society. Alexandra was an important part of this transformation. She became extremely popular with the public. Her fashion influenced society. Women copied her clothing. Her jewelry became famous. And her style was admired across Europe. But there was another side to their lives. Their family had grown. Their children had married into other European royal families. The royal family was connected to many of the great houses of Europe. At the time, this looked like a source of strength. But the future would show something very different. The royal families of Europe were becoming connected through marriage. Yet political rivalries were growing underneath the surface. Britain, Germany, Russia, France, and other European powers were competing for influence. Edward understood the danger. He wanted peace. He believed diplomacy could prevent war. He used his personal relationships to encourage cooperation. But history was moving faster than anyone realized. The king, who had spent decades waiting for his moment, was now trying to keep Europe from moving toward disaster. And while Edward worked to strengthen Britain's international position, his own health was beginning to decline. He had spent years enjoying an active social life, traveling, working, and carrying out demanding royal duties. Now his body was beginning to fail him. The king still had plans. He still wanted to serve. And he still believed there was more work to do. But his reign was approaching its final chapter. And neither Edward nor Alexandra knew how little time they had left together. Edward's health was becoming weaker. For years he had lived an active life. He traveled across Europe, attended royal events, met political leaders, and carried the enormous responsibility of the British crown. But now his body was beginning to fail him. Alexandra could see the change. She had spent decades beside Edward. She knew his habits. She knew his personality. And she knew when something was wrong. Yet Edward continued working. He did not want illness to control his final years as king. He still attended official meetings. He still received visitors. And he still tried to maintain the image of a strong monarch. But behind the palace doors, his family was becoming increasingly worried. Britain was changing. And Edward wanted to leave behind a stable monarchy. He had spent most of his life waiting to become king. Now he understood that his reign might be coming to an end. Alexandra remained beside him. Their marriage had survived decades of pressure, public attention, family problems, and Edward's complicated personality. They were not a perfect couple, but there was a deep connection between them. Alexandra had supported Edward when he was only the Prince of Wales. She had stood beside him when he finally became king. And now she was facing the possibility of losing him. In the spring of 1910, Edward traveled to France. His health was deteriorating, but he continued his public responsibilities. Eventually he returned to Britain. The situation became serious. The king was suffering from severe breathing problems. Doctors became increasingly concerned. Members of the royal family rushed to be near him. Alexandra stayed close to her husband. She refused to leave his side. Edward knew that his time was running out. The man who had waited almost 60 years for the crown had ruled for only 9 years. His reign had been short, but it had changed the way Britain approached diplomacy. He had strengthened Britain's relationship with France. He had helped create a new royal image, and he had brought a more modern social style to the monarchy. But now, the king was dying. On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died. He was 68 years old. Alexandra was devastated. The man who had been beside her for nearly 50 years was gone. The crown now passed to their son. George became King George V. A new era had begun. But Alexandra's life had changed forever. She had been the wife of the king. Now she was the Queen Mother. She continued to appear in public. She continued supporting the royal family. And she remained deeply respected by the British people. But she never forgot Edward. Photographs of him remained part of her private world. His memory stayed with her. The crown had finally come to Edward after a lifetime of waiting. But it had stayed with him for less than a decade. His story became a reminder that sometimes people spend their entire lives waiting for something, only to discover that when it finally arrives, they have very little time to enjoy it. Edward had waited for the crown. Alexandra had waited beside him. And together they had entered history. But their story was not finished yet. Because Alexandra still had many years ahead of her. and she would carry the memory of Edward into a rapidly changing royal world. Edward was gone, but Alexandra's life did not end with his death. She remained connected to the British royal family. Her son George was now king, and the world around the monarchy was changing rapidly. Alexandra continued to support her family. She appeared at royal events. She visited hospitals. She supported charities. And she remained a beloved figure among the British public. But privately, she carried the memory of Edward with her. Their marriage had lasted for decades. They had experienced happiness, family celebrations, political pressure, public attention, and difficult moments. Their relationship had never been perfect, but Alexandra had remained beside him. She had watched him wait for the crown. She had watched him finally become king, and she had watched his health disappear. Now she had to continue without him. Edward's reign had lasted only 9 years. But those years were important. He helped Britain develop stronger diplomatic relationships. He played a major role in improving relations with France. And he helped create a more modern image of the British monarchy. He also understood the importance of personal relationships. He believed that a king could influence politics not only through official meetings, but through conversation, friendship, and diplomacy. His greatest strength was perhaps his personality. He could speak with powerful leaders, but he could also make ordinary people feel comfortable. That ability helped him become an influential figure in Europe. Alexandra also left her own mark. She became a fashion icon. Her style was copied by women across Britain and Europe. Her public appearances attracted enormous attention, and her popularity helped strengthen the public image of the royal family. But perhaps the most emotional part of their story was how long Edward had waited. He was born as the heir to the British throne. He spent decades watching his mother rule. He waited through childhood, youth, marriage, fatherhood, and old age. Then finally, when he was nearly 60, he became king. He had only 9 years on the throne. But he used those years to change the monarchy. He brought a more social and diplomatic style. He helped Britain build new international relationships. And he prepared the royal family for the modern world that was coming. Alexandra lived much longer than Edward. She carried his memory into a new generation. She watched her son become king. She watched Europe change. And she lived through the beginning of a new and dangerous age. The peaceful world Edward had known was disappearing. Within a few years, Europe would be consumed by the First World War. The royal families that had once been connected through marriage would find themselves on opposite sides of a devastating conflict. The world Edward had tried to keep peaceful would soon become unrecognizable. But his legacy remained. He had shown that a king did not always need to rule through fear or distance. Sometimes influence came through personality, conversation, diplomacy, and understanding people. Edward had waited almost his entire life for the crown. And when it finally came, he used his short reign to leave his own mark on British history. Alexandra stood beside him through almost all of it. From their young marriage to his final days. She was more than a queen. She was his companion, his supporter, and the person who shared the long journey toward the crown. Their story is not simply the story of a king and queen. It is the story of two people who spent decades together while history changed around them. Edward waited for the crown. Alexandra waited beside him. And when his reign finally came, it became one of the most fascinating transitions between the Victorian age and modern Britain. If you enjoyed this story, visit my YouTube channel Sleepless Historian. Like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more emotional royal history stories.